Branches kept appearing where there shouldn't have been any.
That was the first thing Deputy Keller said over the radio before the screaming started.
We were deep in the Olympic National Forest, where the fog had already swallowed the trail markers.
It was October of 2004, and the rain had been falling all week.
It was the kind of rain that soaked through your jacket seams and made every tree look black.
Keller kept repeating the same thing over the radio, his voice strained and confused. Branches are moving.
You need to understand something about those woods.
The Hoh River Valley has a silence to it when the rain stops. A silence so thick that your own breathing sounds wrong.
The moss hangs from the trees like wet hair, and once the fog settles low enough, distance disappears entirely.
We lost Keller less than 4 minutes after his last transmission. There were no gunshots and no animal sounds, just the sound of his breathing over the radio.
Then, a noise that sounded almost human set his name back to him from somewhere in the trees.
People ask why some cases never make the papers.
Why entire search operations vanish from public record.
It's because sometimes the official explanation is kinder than the truth. And if you spend enough years out there, you learn there are places where the woods stop behaving correctly.
Back then, I was still working as a seasonal ranger, assigned to wilderness patrol.
I'd been there almost 8 years, long enough to know which trails tourists vanished from most often.
I knew the difference between cougar tracks and black bear movement in wet ground by flashlight.
The locals talked about stretches of forest that changed during heavy fog.
Not haunted, not cursed exactly, just wrong. Hunters would disappear for hours and return miles away with no memory of walking there. And hikers would hear family members calling from places nobody could possibly be standing.
The area where Keller disappeared sat beyond an unofficial service route near an abandoned ranger cabin from the 1930s.
The cabin itself had been condemned after a mudslide damaged the foundation decades earlier.
Nobody used it anymore, except the occasional illegal camper.
3 months before Keller vanished, a volunteer trail worker named Isaac Moran disappeared near the same drainage basin.
They found his backpack hanging 30 feet high in a cedar tree. There were no signs of climbing gear and no footprints around the trunk, just the pack swaying in the rain.
Say in a natural American voice, dry and official. Officially, Keller's case started as a routine missing deputy search.
He'd responded to reports of illegal squatters somewhere near the old service road.
Sunset came, then the fog rolled in, and dispatch lost contact around 8:40 p.m.
By midnight, we had 7 people moving through those woods.
Keller's boot prints were clear for the first mile.
Then the tracks started acting weird.
He was making sharp turns and walking in circles. It looked like he was totally lost out there. The weirdest part was that his radio calls kept moving.
Dispatch tracked his beacon twice after remossing. The signal jumped 2 miles in just 6 minutes.
That kind of terrain is impossible to cover that fast.
One of the guys joked that Keller was teleporting.
Nobody laughed at that one. Around 2 in the morning, the rain finally stopped. Everything went dead silent.
That's when we started hearing the whistling.
It was 3 notes, over and over.
They weren't bird calls. They were way too deliberate. The sound kept moving around us.
I was standing with Holt near a fallen spruce.
The fog was thick, drifting around our waists. He kept sweeping his light through the trees. Then we heard Keller, plain as day, calling out from down the slope.
Holt yelled for him to hold his position.
But then the voice came again.
It was the same tone, but from behind us.
Every hair on my arm stood up.
I headed west with Ellie, our Meg.
Holt and the others went east toward the creek.
The fog just kept getting thicker. Everything beyond 20 feet turned into white static. Ellie stopped dead in her tracks. I almost ran right into her. She didn't say a word, just pointed ahead. I thought it was a person, but it was just a tree.
The bark was peeled away in long strips.
Something had carved marks into the wood.
It wasn't just scratches. It was words.
They said, "Don't follow voices. Cut deep into the tree."
The letters looked rushed and uneven. But the real problem was the rain.
The wood should have been wet, but it was bone dry.
Then Keller's voice came drifting through the fog again.
Keller's voice drifted through the fog again.
It was closer this time.
He just said one word.
Please.
Ellie started toward it immediately.
I grabbed her arm hard enough to hurt.
Because underneath Keller's voice, I heard something else moving.
It wasn't footsteps. It was branches snapping. Something heavy was pacing just outside our view.
The voice spoke again. Please help me.
But the last word stretched out way too long.
Human voices just don't bend like that.
Fearful. Ellie heard it too.
Then our radios exploded with stat.
Holt was yelling through the interference.
Do not follow the voice.
Then came screaming.
3 gunshots rang out. We ran east toward Holt's position.
The fog was thick enough to choke on. Exhausted. Roots kept catching our boots.
And all the while that whistling kept moving around us.
3 notes. Always 3.
We found Holt near the creek bed.
He was alive, but barely.
His face looked gray under the flashlight beam.
One of the volunteers sat beside him shaking.
But Keller wasn't there.
Holt refused to explain what happened.
He just kept staring into the trees.
Finally, he whispered something I still think about.
It knew his voice before he was dead.
Nobody spoke after that.
The trail back wasn't where it should have been.
I'd walked those routes for years.
But suddenly, none of it matched. The terrain felt rearranged.
We passed the same broken maple tree 3 times.
Ellie noticed first. We already walked by this.
Then one of the volunteers started crying.
He pointed his flashlight uphill. There was someone standing between the trees watching us. The figure tilted its head at an impossible angle.
Then it spoke.
Say in a natural American voice, "Ranger."
My stomach dropped.
It was my voice.
Holt raised his sidearm with his good arm.
His hands were shaking violently. Then, more voices started drifting through the trees behind Befinier. A woman crying, a child laughing, someone coughing hard. All layered together beneath that whistling pattern.
Ellie whispered something in Spanish under her breath.
She grabbed my sleeve hard enough to wrinkle the fabric.
Then the figure copier. It repeated the exact same whisper with the exact same cadence.
That broke us.
We ran. There was no formation anymore, no procedure. Just terrified and exhausted. Blind panic through the fog, roots, and darkness. I remember hearing people crashing through the brush beside me. Those voices echoed behind us, from every direction. At one point, I looked over my shoulder. I saw lights moving between the trees.
They weren't flashlights.
They were eyeshine, dozens of them, too high off the ground to be anything human.
We finally reached the service road at sunrise.
Only 4 of us came out together. We were exhausted and covered in mud. The others emerged hours later from completely different sections of the forest. They had no memory of how they got separated.
Keller was never found, at least not officially.
2 weeks later, a backpacker reported hearing a man calling for help. It was near the abandoned cabin after sunset. Search teams checked the area. There was no sign of anyone, just fresh boot prints leading into the trees. The park quietly closed several unofficial routes.
Most records from the incident disappeared.
Holt retired 6 months later.
Ellie transferred out of state and never spoke to us again.
I stayed another 11 years.
Winter of 2015.
There was heavy snow near the western boundary trails. I was alone,
checking storm damage near dusk.
I heard that familiar whistling behind me.
3 notes. Same pattern. Then a voice called from somewhere deep among the trees. It was my own voice, but older, tired, and worn. It said exactly 7 words. You never really left this place, did you?
I never went back after that day. Sometimes late at night, when the rain hits the windows hard, I think about Keller standing somewhere in that fog.
Not dead, not alive, just wandering between those trees.
The forest practices his voice over and over.
It is a sound that never truly leaves you. Every October, hikers near the Hoh River still report hearing a deputy calling for help after dark. It happens somewhere beyond the old condemned ranger cabin, where the fog hangs low between the cedars. It's like pale breath, just waiting in the trees. I often wonder if Keller is still out there, trapped in that shifting geography.
The forest doesn't just hide things. It seems to recycle them.
It keeps the voices and the memories, layering them until the truth is buried. The local legends were never just stories to scare campers. They were warnings about the boundaries of the forest. When the fog rolls in, the rules of space and time seem to dissolve. I remember the way the radio static sounded that night. It wasn't just interference. It felt like the air itself was vibrating. Every time I close my eyes, I can still hear the 3-note whistle.
We were so sure we were the ones in control. We had maps, compasses, and years of experience. But the forest doesn't care about your training or your gear. Sometimes I think about the others who didn't make it out. Isaac Moran, Keller, and all the ones whose names never made the reports. They are part of the landscape now, woven into the moss and the shadows. The silence in the Hoh River Valley is different from anywhere else. It's not the absence of sound, but a presence that waits for you. It's a heavy, suffocating weight that makes you question your own sanity. I wonder if the forest ever gets tired of its game. Does it ever stop mimicking, or is it trapped in its own cycle? Maybe it's just as lost as we are, searching for a way out. I don't go back to the woods anymore. I don't even like the sound of rain on the roof. It reminds me too much of that night, of the whistling, and of that voice. But sometimes when the world is quiet, I think I can still hear it. 3 notes. A pattern that never ends. And I know, somewhere deep in the forest, it's still waiting for me. That night in 2004 still feels like a weight in my chest. I can see the rain slicking the bark, turning the woods into a maze. We were so sure of our training, but the forest had already decided our fate. I remember the radio static when we lost Keller. It wasn't just interference. It felt like the air was vibrating. I can still hear that 3-note whistle echoing through the trees. Our maps and compasses were useless in that basin. The terrain felt like it was shifting under our feet. It was like the forest was playing a game, and we didn't know the rules. I found a boot in the mud and thought it was Keller's. It was just an old, rotted thing, but it reminded me of how people vanish. The forest doesn't leave much behind when it's finished with you. The silence in the valley is a physical presence. It's a heavy, suffocating weight that makes you feel watched. You stop breathing just to see if the forest is listening. I stood there looking up, trying to find a reason. My hands were shaking, and my flashlight beam cut through the fog. I knew then that we were never going to find him. The rain hitting the window sounds different now. It's not just weather. It's a reminder of that night. I sit in the dark and can almost see the trees moving. Sometimes I think the forest is still waiting for me. It's a cycle of voices and whistles that never ends. I wonder if Keller is still out there,
waiting for someone to answer.
I remember the fog looking like pale breath in the trees.
It wasn't just weather. It was like the forest was exhaling.
Every time I think about it, I feel a chill crawling up my spine.
Maybe the truth is just too much for people to handle.
It's easier to believe in accidents than to admit the world stops working.
But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw.
The search for Kellers started right as the sun went down.
We moved in a line, our lights cutting through the thick, damp air. The silence was heavy, broken only by our boots on the wet ground.
Keller's boot prints were easy to follow at first.
But then the tracks started changing, veering off into the brush.
It was like he'd suddenly lost his way, or was being led by something else.
The radio crackled to life, but the signal was all over the place. Dispatch pinged his beacon, and the location shifted 2 miles in minutes.
That's impossible terrain to cover that fast, especially in this weather.
Around 2 in the morning, the rain finally stopped. Then the whistling started, 3 sharp notes echoing through the trees.
It wasn't a bird and it wasn't human, but it sounded way too intentional.
I stood next to Holt, both of us frozen as we heard Keller's voice.
It was plain as day, coming from just 50 yards downslope.
Holt shouted for him to hold, but the voice answered again from behind us.
The realization hit me like a physical blow.
The second voice sounded exactly like the first. Same breath, same exhaustion.
We split up, a decision I still regret as we moved into the fog.
Ellie stopped suddenly, pointing her light at a cedar tree.
The bark was peeled away and carved into the wood were the words, "Don't follow voices."
It looked fresh, but the wood was strangely dry, like it had been there for days.
Keller's voice drifted through the fog again, pleading for help. I grabbed Ellie's arm, holding her back.
I could hear something else moving in the trees, like something heavy pacing. The voice spoke again, but the last word stretched out, bending in a way no human could.
It was unnatural, a distorted mimicry that made my skin crawl.
Then our radios exploded with static, and we heard Holt screaming.
3 gunshots rang out, followed by a silence so absolute, it felt like the forest swallowed the sound. We ran toward Holt's position, crashing through the brush in the dark.
All the while, that 3-note whistle kept circling us.
We found Holt near the creek bed 20 minutes later.
He was alive, but barely.
His shoulder was dislocated, and he looked gray under the light.
One of the volunteers sat beside him, shaking uncontrollably.
Keller wasn't there. Holt wouldn't say what happened at first.
He just kept staring into the trees. Then he whispered something I still think about every day.
He finally whispered it.
It knew his voice before he was dead.
Nobody said a word after that.
We started moving back toward the trailhead before dawn.
We had to stay together. But the trail wasn't where it should have been. None of it matched.
The terrain felt completely rearranged.
We passed the same broken maple tree 3 times.
Ellie noticed it first.
The silence was deafening.
One of the volunteers started crying. He pointed his flashlight uphill.
There was someone standing between the trees.
It was too tall and looked wrong.
The figure's head was tilted at an impossible angle.
Then it spoke. My stomach dropped. It was my voice. Perfectly my voice.
The figure took a step forward.
Branches cracked all around us. The forest was shifting closer.
Holt raised his sidearm, his hands shaking.
More voices started drifting through the trees.
A woman crying. A child laughing.
Ellie whispered something in Spanish. The figure copied her perfectly.
That broke us.
We ran in blind panic.
Voices echoed behind us from every direction.
Sometimes close, sometimes impossibly far.
I looked back and saw lights moving between the trees.
They weren't flashlights, but eye shine. Dozens of them, glowing in the dark.
They were way too high off the ground to be any animal I knew.
We finally reached the service road at sunrise.
Only 4 of us made it out together, huddled in the gray morning light.
The others emerged hours later from completely different sections of the forest. None of the others remembered getting separated from us. Keller was never found, not officially. It was like the forest had simply decided to keep him. A backpacker reported hearing a man calling for help near the old cabin. Search teams checked the area, but they found absolutely nothing. Just fresh boot prints leading into the trees, one set going in and none coming out. The park quietly closed several unofficial routes near the basin.
Most records from the incident just disappeared into administrative archives.
Sad and reflective, Holt retired and Ellie transferred out of state, never speaking to us again.
I stayed another 11 years.
I wish I could tell you why, but maybe part of me needed to know what was out there. Or maybe, after enough time in those woods, leaving just starts to feel impossible. Winter of 2015. Heavy snow near the western boundary trails. I was alone, checking storm damage near dusk when I heard whistling behind me. 3 notes. Same pattern. I froze immediately. The forest was completely still. Then a voice called from somewhere deep among the trees. It was my own voice, older than I remembered it sounding, and tired. It said exactly 7 words.
You never really left this place, did you?
I never went back after that. But sometimes, late at night, when rain hits the windows hard enough, I think about Keller standing somewhere in that fog. Not dead, not alive either. Just wandering between those trees, while something in the forest practices his voice over and over. And every October, hikers near the Hoh River still report hearing a deputy calling for help after dark. The forest remains a place of echoes. Hikers still report hearing a voice calling for help near the old cabin. It is a haunting reminder that some things in these woods never truly leave. Beyond the cabin, the fog hangs low between the cedars. It is like pale breath waiting in the trees. The silence is heavy, broken only by the wind. I often wonder if Keller is still out there. He is not dead, but he is not alive either. He is just a part of the forest now. The forest practices his voice over and over. It is a cruel mimicry, designed to lure the unsuspecting. I can almost hear him calling out in the wind. I think about the others who vanished. They're all part of the same collection now. It is a chorus of the lost, echoing through the trees. I still have the flashlight I used back then. It sits on my shelf, a heavy reminder of that night. I rarely turn it on anymore, afraid of what I might see. The Hoh River Valley is quiet now, but it is a deceptive peace. The trees still stand, ancient and watchful. If you find yourself near those trails, stay on the path. Don't listen to the whistles. Don't follow any voices you hear in the fog. I look at the map sometimes, tracing the lines of the forest, where we lost him. It all looks so simple on paper. The forest is still there, waiting. Every October, the cycle begins again. I'm done with those woods, but they aren't done with me.